I'm Natalie, 22, female, and my dad claimed medical school was too risky to fund, but paid $250,000 for my sister's law degree. That single decision wasn't just about money. It was the final, gleaming tip of an iceberg of favoritism and deceit that had been floating in the cold waters of our family for my entire life. I just didn't know then that its hidden mass was a secret so destructive it would eventually sink us all. Our family, from the outside, was the picture of suburban success. We lived in a spacious two-story house with a manicured lawn in a neighborhood where the cars were new and the school districts were top-rated. My father, Robert, was the architect of this illusion. He owned a successful regional business consulting firm and carried himself with an air of unshakable confidence. He was a man who spoke in certainties, who believed in calculated risks and sure-thing investments. My mother, Helen, a former teacher, was the heart of the home, a gentle and diplomatic presence whose main role, I would later realize, was to smooth over the cracks my father's rigid personality created. And then there was my sister, Chloe. 2 years older than me, Chloe was my father's masterpiece. She was charismatic and effervescent, with a quick wit and a social grace that made her the center of any room she entered. She was pursuing law, a path my father had championed from the moment she aced her first debate tournament in high school. He called it a prestigious and powerful career, a guaranteed return on investment. Chloe was, in his eyes, a blue-chip stock. I, on the other hand, was the speculative venture. I was quieter, more studious, and my passion wasn't for arguments and loopholes, but for the elegant, logical certainties of the natural world. I loved biology, chemistry, the intricate puzzle of the human body. From the age of 12, when I'd successfully splinted my dog's leg with a ruler and duct tape after he took a tumble down the stairs, much to our vet's amusement and approval, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. My dream was not about prestige, it was about a deep-seated need to fix what was broken. My father, however, only saw the risk. "So many years of school, Natalie," he'd say with a sigh, steepling his fingers. "And what if you don't get into a good residency? What if you decide you don't like it? It's a long, uncertain road." This dynamic, the championing of Chloe and the questioning of me, was the background music of my childhood. The examples are so numerous they blur together, but a few stand out in sharp relief. I remember our 8th grade, career day presentations. Chloe, a 10th grader, had built an elaborate, multimedia presentation on being a corporate lawyer, complete with professionally printed charts my dad had made for her at his office. He took the morning off work to watch her, sitting in the front row of the school auditorium, beaming with pride. When she finished, he stood up and started the applause. 2 hours later, it was my turn in a small, stuffy classroom. My project was a detailed poster board on the life of a cardiothoracic surgeon. I had spent weeks researching, drawing diagrams of the heart, and even interviewing a local surgeon's nurse. My dad had promised he'd be there. I kept glancing at the door, but it remained closed. I gave my presentation to a room of my peers and my slightly bored English teacher. When I got home, my dad was on the phone in his office. He waved me away, mouthing I got tied up. Later, he glanced at my poster board, which I'd propped up in the kitchen. "Good work, honey," he said, his eyes already drifting back to the financial news on the TV. Lots of squiggly lines. Chloe's professionally printed board, meanwhile, was given a place of honor on the living room mantelpiece for a month. The disparity became even more tangible when we started driving. For her 16th birthday, Chloe was gifted a brand-new metallic blue convertible. My dad made a big show of it, tying a giant red bow on the hood and filming Chloe's ecstatic reaction. His justification was that she was social and responsible and needed a reliable car to get to her various extracurriculars. 2 years later, on my 16th birthday, I was handed the keys to my mom's 10-year-old minivan. It had over 100,000 miles, a strange rattling sound when it idled, and a lingering scent of old coffee and forgotten French fries. "It's a tank, Natalie," my dad said, clapping me on the shoulder with an air of finality. "Much safer for a new driver. Besides, a little humility builds character." Chloe zipped past in her convertible as he said it, waving with a pitying smile. The final act before the financial bombshell was our college choices. My father and Chloe had endless conversations about which law schools were the best, which clerkships were the most prestigious. He helped her with her applications, edited her essays, and celebrated her acceptance into a top-tier law school as if he had won the lottery. With me, every conversation about my pre-med track was a gentle interrogation. Are you sure you have the stamina for it? Organic chemistry is a killer, I hear. Maybe you should consider something more practical, like pharmacy or hospital administration. Less risk. Despite his skepticism, I persevered. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in biology. I spent my summers volunteering at a local clinic and working in a research lab to build my resume. I had a near-perfect GPA and was scoring high on my MCAT practice tests. I had done everything right, everything I could to prove that my dream wasn't a risk, but a viable, passionate goal. I had saved some money from my part-time job, but medical school, with its astronomical tuition, was a financial mountain I couldn't climb alone. I knew it was time to officially ask for his help. I scheduled a meeting with him, just as he had always taught me to do for important matters. I sat across from him in the dark wood and leather of his home office, the room where all major family decisions were made. I laid out my acceptance letters to several excellent post-baccalaureate programs and a detailed budget for the first year of medical school. I made my case calmly and logically, showing him my grades, my test scores, my letters of recommendation. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was asking for an investment, the same kind of investment he was making in Chloe. He listened patiently, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning in the quiet room. He looked at the papers, then at me, with a look of profound, paternal disappointment that twisted my stomach into a knot. "Natalie," he began, his voice laced with a weary sort of kindness that was worse than anger. "I am incredibly proud of your hard work. I am, but we have to be realistic. This is an enormous financial undertaking with no guarantee at the end. Law, what Chloe is doing, is a direct path to a stable, high-earning career. Medicine, it's a gamble. A very, very expensive gamble. As the financial head of this family, I can't, in good conscience, risk our stability on such an uncertain venture." "I'm sorry, my answer is no." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. It wasn't about the money, he implied. It was about me. I was the uncertain venture. I was the gamble not worth taking. I left his office that day with my carefully prepared folders, my throat tight with tears I refused to let fall. I felt a profound sense of injustice, but I swallowed it. I would do it myself. I would prove him wrong. I had no idea that the real reason for his refusal was far more selfish and sordid than I could have ever imagined. The weeks following my father's rejection were a blur of bruised pride and grim determination. I accepted a full-time position as a research assistant at the university hospital, working under a brilliant but demanding immunologist. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover my rent on a tiny apartment, my student loan payments from undergrad, and the barest of necessities. Every dollar left over was funneled into a savings account I labeled Med School Fund. It grew at a glacial pace. My life became a monotonous cycle. Wake up at dawn, work 10-hour days in the lab surrounded by the sterile scent of ethanol and the hum of centrifuges, come home to eat a frugal dinner of rice and beans, and then study for the MCATs until my eyes burned. I was exhausted, but I was also fueled by a defiant fire. Every successful experiment in the lab, every chapter of the MCAT prep book I mastered, was a small victory, a brick I was laying in the foundation of a future he refused to help me build. I saw my family infrequently. The Sunday dinners that had been a mandatory part of my life for 2 decades became optional. I often used my demanding work schedule as an excuse, and while my mother would sigh with disappointment, no one pushed too hard. It was easier for them, I think, to not have my quiet struggle present at their dinner table, a silent accusation against my father's decree. About 2 months after my meeting with my father, my mother called, her voice insistent. "Natalie, you have to come to dinner this Sunday. No excuses. Your father has a very special announcement to make." A sense of dread washed over me. Special announcements in our family usually revolved around Chloe. I agreed to go, steeling myself for whatever was coming. That Sunday, I walked into my childhood home and was immediately struck by the festive atmosphere. My mother had used the good china, there were flowers on the table, and a bottle of expensive champagne was chilling in a silver bucket. Chloe was glowing, dressed in a stylish silk blouse, looking every bit the successful future lawyer. My father was holding court in the living room, a broad, magnanimous smile on his face. We sat down to dinner, and the small talk felt strained. I picked at my food, my stomach churning with anxiety. Finally, after the main course was cleared, my father stood up, tapping his glass with a fork for attention. "As you all know," he began, beaming at Chloe, "our Chloe is about to embark on an incredible journey. She's not just going to law school, she's going to one of the best law schools in the country. Her mother and I believe that a mind like hers should be free to focus entirely on her studies, without the burden of financial worry." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping the table before landing on me for a fraction of a second. "That is why we have decided to fund her entire legal education. Tuition, books, living expenses, everything. It's a significant investment, of course." He let out a self-satisfied chuckle. "We're looking at about $250,000, but there is no better investment than in the future of our children." The room erupted. My mother teared up, reaching across the table to squeeze Chloe's hand. Chloe, for her part, looked both ecstatic and entitled, as if this was nothing less than her due. "Oh, Daddy, thank you," she gushed. "You have no idea what this means to me." I sat frozen in my chair, the fork heavy in my hand. $250,000. $250,000. The number echoed in the sudden silence of my mind. It was an astronomical sum, a life-changing amount of money, and he was just giving it to her. The man who, just 2 months prior, had looked me in the eye and told me that the far lesser cost of my first year of medical school was too much of a gamble for the family to afford. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so staggering, that I couldn't speak. It felt like a physical blow. He wasn't just funding her, he was making a public declaration of her worth versus mine. She was the sure thing. I was the write-off. I must have looked as stunned as I felt, because my mother quickly turned to me, her expression a mixture of pleading and warning. "Isn't it wonderful, Natalie? We're so proud of both our girls." The lie was so transparent it was almost comical. I mumbled a congratulations, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I couldn't look at my father. I could feel his gaze on me, challenging me to question him, to make a scene. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I retreated into a cold, quiet shell for the rest of the evening, answering questions in monosyllables and focusing on the pattern of the tablecloth. As I drove back to my tiny apartment that night, the triumphant scene replayed in my head. And for the first time, the hurt began to curdle into suspicion. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just favoritism anymore, it was illogical. My father was a man of numbers and pragmatism. How could he justify a $250,000 investment in one child while claiming poverty to the other? Even if he preferred law to medicine, the sheer financial disparity made no sense. His business was successful, yes, but was it that successful? In the following weeks, I started paying closer attention. The seed of doubt planted at that dinner table began to sprout. I noticed small things, anomalies in the rock-solid facade of my father. He, a man who prided himself on transparency and control, had become more secretive. He would angle his phone away from my mother when a text came in. He started getting the mail himself, quickly sorting through it in his car before bringing it inside. Once, when I stopped by to pick up a book I'd left, I overheard him on the phone in his office, his voice low and agitated. "That's not what we agreed upon," he hissed. "The market is volatile right now, you know that." He hung up abruptly when he saw me standing in the doorway, his face pale. "Just a difficult client," he said, forcing a smile. But his eyes were shifty, and he couldn't quite meet my gaze. The man who preached about sound financial planning and the dangers of uncertainty was suddenly behaving like someone who was walking on a tightrope. The proud pronouncements about Chloe's funding started to sound less like a celebration of her success and more like a desperate performance, a show put on for an audience of his peers, his family, and maybe even himself. He wasn't just investing in her future, he was propping up an image. And I was beginning to suspect that the foundation of that image was starting to crumble. The question was, why? The suspicion was a constant, low-grade fever in the back of my mind. It colored every interaction, every phone call. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that I was just bitter and resentful. My father had always favored Chloe. This was just the most expensive and hurtful example of a lifelong pattern. But my scientific mind, trained to look for patterns and question anomalies, couldn't let it go. The data didn't add up. The man I knew, the meticulous, risk-averse financial planner, would not make such a wildly unbalanced decision without a hidden variable. One Sunday, I decided to try a direct approach. I found my mother alone in the kitchen, arranging flowers in a vase. She had a placid, almost determinedly cheerful air about her these days, as if she could keep the family's equilibrium perfect through sheer force of will. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my tone casual. "I've been thinking about the money for Chloe's school. It's a lot. Are you sure Dad's firm is doing well enough for that to be comfortable?" Her hands stilled. She didn't look at me, focusing instead on snipping the end of a rose stem with surgical precision. "Natalie, please don't start," she said, her voice tight. "Your father is a very smart man. He knows what he's doing. You should be happy for your sister." "I am happy for her," I lied. "I'm just worried. It seems like a huge expense right after he told me things were too tight to help me." "You're just jealous," she snapped, finally turning to look at me, her eyes flashing with a surprising defensiveness. "You're trying to stir up trouble because you didn't get what you wanted. You need to learn to trust your father. He has always provided for this family, and he always will." Her reaction was the confirmation I didn't know I was looking for. It wasn't the calm reassurance of a confident spouse. It was the sharp, panicked defense of someone trying to protect a fragile secret. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but she knew enough to be scared of the questions I was asking. I dropped the subject, but her denial only solidified my resolve. I couldn't trust them to tell me the truth. I would have to find it myself. The opportunity came unexpectedly a week later. My parents were going away for the weekend to celebrate a wedding anniversary. They asked me to stop by the house to water the plants and check on things. As I stood in the unnerving silence of the empty house, I felt a knot of guilt in my stomach. Snooping felt like a betrayal. But then I remembered the feeling of my father's rejection, the sight of Chloe's smug smile, my mother's brittle defensiveness. The betrayal, I reasoned, had not started with me. I went straight to his office. It was his sanctuary, the one room in the house that was unequivocally his. It smelled of old books, leather, and his cologne. I sat down in his chair, the leather cool against my skin, and turned on his desktop computer. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't know his password, but I tried a few logical guesses: Chloe's birthday, their anniversary, the name of his firm. Nothing. Then, on a whim, I typed in "sure thing 1." It was the phrase he used constantly, his highest praise for an investment for a person. The screen flickered and unlocked. The password was Chloe. Of course it was. I didn't know what I was looking for. I opened his email, scanning through endless messages from clients and business newsletters. It all looked perfectly normal. Then I saw it. Tucked away on the computer's desktop was a folder simply labeled Accounts. My breath caught. I clicked it open. Inside were dozens of PDF files, bank statements from their main checking and savings accounts, investment portfolio reports. I opened the most recent statement for their primary savings account, the one that should have been flush with cash. I gasped. The balance was shockingly low. Far, far lower than it should have been for a man who had just committed to a $250,000 expense. There were regular, large transfers out of the account, but the corresponding deposits into Chloe's tuition account weren't there. The money was just vanishing. My eyes scanned the desktop again, and this time I noticed something I'd missed before. A separate icon for a web browser I didn't recognize, a niche one known for its enhanced privacy features. I opened it. The browse history hadn't been cleared. My blood ran cold as I read the list of recently visited sites. They weren't for business consulting or financial markets. They were names I vaguely recognized from late-night television ads and pop-up banners. BetLux, Apex Online Poker, Global Sports Wager. My hands started to tremble. This was the hidden variable. This was the piece of the puzzle that made everything else make sense. My father wasn't investing, he was gambling. Frantically, I started searching through the Accounts folder again, this time looking for anything related to those sites. I found a subfolder named Personal Finance, buried inside another folder labeled MISC. It was a deliberate attempt to hide it. Inside were statements from an e-wallet service I'd never heard of. I opened the most recent one. It was a nightmare in black and white. A dizzying list of transactions, deposits from my parents' savings account, and then dozens upon dozens of transfers out to the gambling sites. Small wins were immediately followed by bigger, more desperate-looking bets. He was chasing his losses. It was the classic, textbook behavior of an addict. I scrolled and scrolled, the numbers blurring through the tears that had started to well in my eyes. The man who had lectured me my entire life about risk and responsibility was engaged in the riskiest, most irresponsible behavior imaginable. The hypocrisy was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I felt sick. I sat there in the silence of my father's office, the glow of the monitor illuminating the damning evidence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every memory, every conversation, every lecture on financial prudence was instantly recast in the harsh, unflattering light of this new truth. My father, the pillar of stability, the man who built his identity on being in control, was a fraud. I clicked through the statements from the e-wallet, my movements numb and mechanical. I was no longer just looking, I was compiling data, my scientist brain taking over as a defense mechanism against the emotional hurricane raging inside me. I opened a spreadsheet, tracking the dates and amounts. A horrifying pattern emerged. The gambling had started small a year or so ago, with amounts that could be dismissed as a hobby. But in the last 6 months, it had escalated dramatically. The deposits from my parents' savings account became larger and more frequent. The bets were wilder, spanning everything from international soccer matches to obscure online poker tournaments. Then I found it, a period of about 2 weeks right before my scheduled meeting with him to discuss medical school funding. It was a bloodbath, a string of catastrophic losses, one after another. He was doubling down, tripling down, trying to win back what he'd lost in a desperate, panicked frenzy. I tallied the numbers from that 2-week period. The final sum made me gasp, a sharp, ragged intake of breath in the quiet room. He had lost just over $40,000. $40,000. It was almost exactly what I had estimated for my first year of tuition and expenses. The money he told me was too risky to gamble on my future had already been gambled away on his. It all clicked into place with a sickening finality. His refusal had nothing to do with his confidence in me or the risks of a medical career. It was a lie, a carefully constructed excuse to cover a hole in the family finances that he himself had created. He couldn't give me the money because the money was gone. The grand announcement about Chloe's law school funding took on a new, more sinister meaning. It wasn't just about favoritism anymore. It was a desperate, theatrical performance designed to mask his failure. By making such a lavish, public commitment to her, he was shoring up his crumbling facade. He was shouting to the world, and to himself, that he was still the successful, powerful provider, the man in complete control of his family's destiny. He had likely taken out a massive loan or liquidated a protected investment to cover Chloe's expenses, digging the family into an even deeper hole, all to maintain the illusion. He had sacrificed my dream on the altar of his pride. He chose to protect his secret rather than support his daughter. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it felt like it hollowed me out from the inside. It wasn't just about the money or the missed opportunity. It was the realization that my entire relationship with my father was built on a lie. His lectures, his advice, his carefully crafted image, it was all a performance. The man I thought I knew simply didn't exist. I sat back in his expensive leather chair, the same chair he had sat in when he'd crushed my spirit, and I felt a strange calm descend. The hurt and confusion were still there, but they were crystallizing into something colder, harder: resolve. The anger was a clean, sharp point. He had treated me like a fool. He had used his paternal authority to manipulate and deceive me, all to hide his own weakness. I methodically began to save the evidence. I downloaded the bank statements, the e-wallet transaction histories, and the browser history logs onto a flash drive I found in his desk drawer. I then went to the printer and printed out hard copies of the most damning pages, the statement showing the $40,000 loss, and the savings account summary showing its depleted balance. I arranged the papers into a neat, undeniable stack. As I worked, I thought of my mother's brittle defense and Chloe's smug superiority. Did they know? My mother, I suspected, knew something was wrong, but chose to look the other way, to believe the comfortable lie over the ugly truth. Her passivity was a form of complicity. And Chloe? She was so wrapped up in being the sure thing that she probably never questioned the source of her good fortune. She benefited too much from the lie to ever challenge it. I placed the stack of papers in the center of his large mahogany desk, right where he would see them the moment he walked in. This was no longer just about my future. It was about exposing the truth that was rotting our family from its core. There would be a reckoning. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew it would begin here, in this room, with this stack of undeniable proof. The silence of the house no longer felt unnerving. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I was the one who was about to unleash the thunder. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation. I went to work at the lab, pipetting liquids and recording data, my movements precise and automatic, while my mind endlessly rehearsed the coming confrontation. The flash drive with the digital copies of his secrets felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of the bomb I was about to detonate. I knew I couldn't wait. The longer I held onto the truth, the more it would poison me. I chose my moment carefully. On Sunday evening, I knew my mother and Chloe were going to a movie. I drove to my parents' house, my heart a steady, cold drum in my chest. I let myself in with my old key and went straight to his office, the papers I had printed still sitting in a neat stack on my passenger seat. I walked in and found him at his desk, staring at his computer screen, a look of intense, strained concentration on his face. He was probably checking scores. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Natalie, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "No," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "Nothing is all right." I walked over to his desk and placed the stack of papers directly in front of him on top of his keyboard. I didn't say a word. I just watched his face. He looked down at the top page, a printout of the e-wallet statement showing a cascade of losses. His eyes scanned the familiar logos of the betting sites. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked old and frail. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Does it matter?" I replied, crossing my arms. "It's the truth, isn't it?" His shock quickly curdled into anger, his default defense mechanism. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "This is my private information. You went through my computer. You snooped in my office. That is an unbelievable violation of trust, Natalie." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Trust," I said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You want to talk to me about trust? You, who looked me in the eye and told me my dream of being a doctor was too much of a gamble for this family to afford? You want to lecture me on trust when you had already lost my entire first year's tuition on online poker?" My words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, leaning against the credenza for support. The anger drained away, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal panic. "You don't understand," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what it looks like. It's a hobby. It got a little out of hand, that's all. The market has been stressful, the pressure of the firm." "Stop," I said, my voice rising, sharp and clear. "Stop lying. I saw the statements, Dad. I saw all of it. The constant transfers, chasing losses, the $40,000 you torched right before you told me we couldn't afford to help me. This isn't a hobby. It's an addiction, and you sacrificed me to hide it. Tears of rage and hurt finally started to well in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The whole performance for Chloe, I continued, my voice shaking. The grand announcement, the $250,000. How are you paying for that? Did you take out a second mortgage? Did you liquidate your retirement accounts? You're setting this family up for ruin, all to save face. He finally broke. The confident, authoritative man I had known my whole life seemed to deflate, collapsing back into his chair. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The confession, when it came, was a pathetic, jumbled mess of whispers and self-pity. I didn't know what else to do, he mumbled into his hands. It got away from me. I thought I could win it back. I just needed one big win. When you asked for the money for school, I couldn't admit that it was gone. I was so ashamed. So you made me feel ashamed instead, I said quietly. You made me feel worthless. Paying for Chloe's school? It felt like the only way, he continued, not hearing me, lost in his own narrative of victimhood. To show everyone that everything was still fine, that I was still in control. I took out a business loan. I told them it was for expansion. He looked up at me then, his eyes red and pleading. Natalie, please, we can fix this. Don't tell your mother, it would destroy her. We can keep this between us. And in that moment, seeing his weakness, his selfishness, his absolute refusal to take full responsibility even now, I felt no pity. Only a cold, profound disgust. He wasn't sorry for what he did, he was sorry he got caught. He wanted me to be his co-conspirator, to help him uphold the very lie that had shattered my trust and derailed my future. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of the front door opening and closing. "Robert, we're home," my mother's cheerful voice called out. The movie was wonderful. My father's head snapped up, his face a mask of pure terror. "Please, Natalie," he begged in a frantic whisper. "Don't." Footsteps approached the office. The door swung open, and my mother and Chloe stood there, their smiles fading as they took in the scene. My father looking utterly broken, and me standing over him like an executioner, the damning papers spread across his desk. "What on earth is going on?" my mother asked, her eyes darting between us. "Robert, Natalie, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath. The time for secrets was over. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, "you should sit down. There's something you need to know about where the family's money has really been going." The atmosphere in the office became thick with a dreadful silence. My mother and Chloe stood frozen in the doorway, their expressions shifting from cheerful curiosity to alarm. My father remained slumped in his chair, a defeated man who couldn't bring himself to look at them. "Natalie, what are you talking about?" my mother asked, taking a tentative step into the room. Chloe followed, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed with suspicion, aimed squarely at me. I didn't answer my mother directly. Instead, I picked up the top sheet from the stack of papers, the statement showing the frantic series of bets and the $40,000 loss, and held it out for her to see. "I think you should ask Dad," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Ask him about his hobby." My mother took the paper, her hand trembling slightly. She stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion at first, then dawning horror as she recognized the names of the online betting sites. She looked from the paper to her husband, her face pale. "Robert, what is this?" Chloe snatched the paper from our mother's hand. Her eyes, trained for quick analysis, scanned the page far faster. I watched her face, expecting shock, perhaps even sympathy for me. I was wrong. Her expression hardened, her jaw setting in a familiar, stubborn line. "Dad has been gambling, Mom," I said, filling the silence. "He's lost a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars. That's why he told me he couldn't help with my school. The money wasn't there. He lied to all of us." The room imploded. My mother let out a small, wounded cry and sank onto the small sofa against the wall, her hand over her mouth. My father started stammering, trying to spin a new web of half-truths and excuses, but the evidence was too stark, too undeniable. Then Chloe spoke, and her words were the final, decisive blow to any hope I had of salvaging a relationship with my sister. "Okay," she said, her voice sharp and pragmatic, as if she were in a boardroom, not the wreckage of her family. She turned to my father. "Is my tuition money safe? The loan you took out, is it secure?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. That was her first question. Not, "Are you okay, Dad?" Not, "Natalie, I'm so sorry." Not even, "How could this happen?" Her only concern was for herself, for the golden path that had been paved for her with lies. "Chloe," my mother gasped, shocked by her daughter's coldness. "What?" Chloe shot back, turning on her. "It's a valid question. Is Natalie trying to blow everything up now, so he made a mistake? Are we supposed to let her destroy the entire family over it? He said he was handling it." She then rounded on me, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is so selfish of you, Natalie. You couldn't just accept Dad's decision, could you? You had to dig and dig until you found something to hurt him with. You're tearing this family apart." Her accusation struck me with the force of a physical slap. Selfish? I was selfish. I, who had been working myself to the bone, living on next to nothing, all while she was being handed a $250,000 future. I, who had been lied to and dismissed. "I'm tearing the family apart?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "He's the one who has been lying to us for over a year. He's the one with the secret addiction. He's the one who chose to sacrifice my future to protect his pride. But I'm the selfish one for bringing the truth to light." My mother, true to her role, tried to play peacemaker. "Children, please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "We can't do this. We're a family. Robert, you should have told me. We could have dealt with this, quietly." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Natalie, honey, this is a family matter. We can forgive your father. We can work through this together. We don't need to be this angry." In that moment, I saw them all with perfect, painful clarity. My father, the addict and the liar. My sister, the cold, calculating beneficiary of H's lies. And my mother, the enabler, the one whose desperate need for peace and appearances allowed the poison to spread unchecked. She confessed she had suspected he had a small problem, but had been too afraid to confront it, choosing willful ignorance instead. They were a unit, a dysfunctional, toxic unit built on secrets, favoritism, and denial. And I was the foreign body, the inconvenient truth they now wanted to absorb and silence. They didn't want to fix the problem, they wanted to manage the scandal. A profound sense of loneliness washed over me, so total and absolute it was almost peaceful. I knew what I had to do. I looked at the three of them, my broken father, my weeping mother, my furious sister, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty distance. "No," I said softly. "We can't work through this, because you don't want to work through it, you want to bury it." I turned without another word and walked out of the office. I went up the stairs to my old bedroom, the room that felt like it belonged to a different person from a different lifetime. I pulled my old suitcase from the top of the closet and began to pack. I took only my clothes, my books, and a few sentimental items that predated the family's rot. I was halfway down the stairs when my father appeared at the bottom, his face a mess of tears and desperation. "Natalie, wait, don't go, we can fix this, I promise. I'll get help. I'll do anything." My mother stood behind him, crying silently. Chloe watched from the living room doorway, her expression a cold mask of judgment. I stopped on the landing and looked down at him. "Your promises don't mean anything to me anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not going to be the family scapegoat. I'm not going to stick around and pretend that this is okay. I'm not going to let my future be the price for your secrets." I walked down the last few stairs, suitcase rolling behind me. I didn't look at any of them as I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool night air. I closed the door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like the final, merciful end to a story that should have been over long ago. I was done. The first few weeks after I left were the hardest. I crashed on the couch of a friend from college, a kind soul named Sarah who asked few questions and offered endless cups of tea. The weight of my decision, of the family I had detonated and walked away from, was immense. I felt adrift, unmoored from the only foundation I had ever known, as toxic as it was. My tiny apartment, which had once felt like a symbol of my struggle, now seemed like a sanctuary, and I couldn't wait to get back to its solitude. My phone became a source of constant anxiety. It buzzed incessantly with the fallout. There were tearful, rambling voicemails from my mother, pleading with me to come home and be reasonable, to think of the family's reputation. There were texts from my father, filled with hollow promises to pay me back and get help, though he was always vague on the details. And then there were the messages from Chloe. They were sharp, angry, and laced with accusation. She blamed me for our mother's distress, for putting our father under unbearable pressure, and for being a drama queen. In her version of reality, I was the villain, the homewrecker. After a particularly vicious text from her accusing me of trying to sabotage her law school funding out of jealousy, I made a decision. I couldn't heal in the middle of a war zone. I went to a store and bought a new SIM card. I changed my number and shared it only with Sarah and a few other trusted friends. I blocked my father, mother, and sister on every social media platform. The silence that followed was immediate and blissful. I sent them one final email from a new, anonymous account. It was short and to the point. I will consider re-establishing contact on one condition. Dad, you must enroll in and consistently attend a certified program for gambling addiction. Mom and Chloe, you must attend family counseling to understand the roles you played in enabling his behavior and perpetuating the lies. This isn't about the money. This is about acknowledging the profound betrayal and the damage it has caused. Until you are all willing to face the actual truth, there is nothing for us to talk about. I never received a reply. With the door to my past firmly closed, I poured all my energy into my future. I took on extra shifts at the lab, my work becoming a refuge. The complex problems of immunology were a welcome distraction from the complex problems of my family. The science was logical, it had rules. I sold my old, character-building minivan and used the money, along with my meager savings, to put a deposit on a new, more reliable used car. It was a small thing, but it was mine. Every choice, every purchase, every step forward was entirely my own, and the feeling was intoxicatingly liberating. I channeled my anger and hurt int. Oh, my MCAT studies. I treated it like a full-time job. Every practice question I got right felt like a victory over my father's skepticism. Every point I gained on a practice test felt like a repudiation of his belief that I was a gamble. When the time came, I walked into the testing center with a calm resolve. I finished the exam feeling drained but confident. Months later, the results came in. I had not just done well, I had excelled. My score was in the 98th percentile. It was a score that opened doors, a score that no one could argue with. It was my proof in black and white. Armed with my GPA, my lab experience, and my test scores, I applied to medical schools. The process was daunting, and I did it all alone, filling out applications late at night in my small apartment, writing essays about my passion for medicine without ever mentioning the family drama that had fueled my determination. I took out student loans, navigated the labyrinth of financial aid, and secured a small merit-based scholarship from my undergraduate university. The interview invitations started to arrive. I flew to cities I'd never seen, sleeping on cheap motel beds and ironing my one good suit on the floor. In every interview, when they asked me why I wanted to be a doctor, I spoke with a passion and conviction that was forged in fire. I spoke about wanting to solve problems, to heal, to bring truth and clarity to complex situations. A little over a year after I walked out of my parents' house, I received a thick envelope from my top-choice medical school. My hands trembled as I tore it open. "It is with great pleasure," the letter began, "that we offer you a place in the entering class." I sat down on my floor and cried. Not tears of sadness or anger, but tears of pure, unadulterated triumph. I had done it, on my own terms, against all odds. I hear things about my family sometimes, through the grapevine of distant relatives and old family friends. I heard my father's consulting firm lost a few major clients and that he had to sell the practice. I heard they downsized, moving out of my childhood home into a much smaller townhouse. Chloe, I believe, is still in law school, but I imagine the full funding has become a much more complicated reality. Their world, built on a foundation of lies, seems to be crumbling just as I knew it would. But it is no longer my world. It is no longer my burden to bear, my problem to fix, or my secret to keep. I am building a new foundation, one of honesty, hard work, and resilience. My future is my own, and for the first time in my life, it feels like a sure thing. So, to anyone out there who has been made to feel small to cover for someone else's big secrets, to anyone who has been told their dream is too risky by the very people who should be their biggest supporters, your worth is not determined by their validation. Your path is your own. Sometimes, the bravest and healthiest thing you can do is to walk away from the people who are holding you back, and never, ever look back.